I have never been a fan of roguelikes. They combine my distaste for trivial RPG min-max number crunching and grinding with boring procedural level design, sapping out the human soul of exploring virtual spaces. Most frustrating is their dependency on luck, offering random items and upgrades that change every time you play. Skill may get you far, but you are always at the mercy of a random number generator, forcing you to replay the entire game just to get back to the section that killed you last time. It's ultimately because of these factors that I simply avoid roguelikes outright, and I must admit that I haven't even played that many of them. The mere sight of RPG damage values appearing after attacking an enemy is enough for me to reconsider if something is worth my time. The moment an otherwise interesting new game reveals itself to be a roguelike, however, is when I firmly decide that I will never play it. Deadlink is a first-person shooter with high-speed movement, aggressive enemies, and a variety of satisfying abilities to blast through its many arenas in style. It's also a roguelike, or at least a roguelite, and yet here I am to sing its praises. It doesn't deviate much from the established formula. Each session starts from the beginning as you progress towards the final boss, while being offered a selection of randomly assigned upgrades and challenges to improve your chances of success. Death is permanent, but a meta progression system allows for persistent upgrades that carry into every future run. Smartly borrowing from Doom Eternal, players are directly incentivized to use their full arsenal in proactive, expressive ways. Enemies must be marked with grenades or other class-specific special moves in order for them to drop shields upon death, which is the only consistent way to improve defense in the middle of a battle, as there are no health pickups. Heavy weapon ammunition only drops from C-balls in the environment, encouraging constant movement and engagement within the space, rather than enabling the player to camp away from the action. Cybernetic foes will ruthlessly swarm the player in groups, pushing them into tight corners and raining down telegraphed area of effect attacks from the other side of the map, ensuring that nowhere is safe. Bosses combine large, demanding targets with clusters of standard adversaries to drive pressure and provide the player a chance to replenish their resources. While the final boss is a bit of a busy mess, the penultimate third boss is an absolute highlight, combining a central pillar of rotating hazards with constantly shifting platforms, suspended above a hazardous toxic floor. The player is expected to simultaneously deal damage to the boss, manage the surrounding enemies, and platform around the environment safely, weaving through giant laser beams and dodging missiles. Playing as anything other than the soldier class, with its momentum-carrying grapple hook, feels like a disservice to this incredibly engaging boss. Implant chips are Deadlink's primary upgrades that randomly alternate between runs, and must be equipped to a specific action that the combat shell can perform. For instance, every time the player uses their class's primary ability, the implant's active effect is triggered. Some examples include the next weapon shot or thrown grenade dealing additional damage, ability cooldowns reduced by a certain amount of time, or the player's combat shell gaining a brief moment of immunity. One of these categories activates the implant every time the player switches between their two weapons. If you're experienced with fast-paced boomer shooters, you may have already realized the potential here. Quickly swapping weapons is already considered optimal in these games, as it bypasses recoil and recovery animations between shots, allowing for a higher rate of fire and therefore dealing more damage per second. It also just looks and feels a lot cooler to be rapidly switching across your entire arsenal to form powerful combos, instead of holding down left click on a single gun. By tying active buffs to the weapon swap action, like making the next shot deal bonus damage, resetting the dash cooldown, or firing out a homing shot to tag enemies, new players are encouraged to understand and adopt this proactive playstyle. With the right synergy, you could have several seconds of invincibility upon using the grapple hook, combined with the shell upgrade that resets its cooldown after killing a hooked enemy, turning you into a near-invulnerable terror of the skies. Regain full weapon ammunition and have unlimited dashes after breaking a C-ball, or regain 25% shotgun ammo every time you grapple. Increase movement speed after using the engineer's Wormlink breach, combined with the shell upgrade that drastically lowers its cooldown after killing a linked enemy, along with a weapon swap action that further reduces all cooldowns to become an unstoppable powerhouse. This is Deadlink at its best, but it's up to random chance if you'll ever get to experience it. Some of the best passive upgrades, like receiving extra dashes, feel borderline essential, as the base dash cooldown seems intentionally slowed down in order to make the implants appear more useful. It's common knowledge that the most successful creatures in nature are the ones willing to adapt alongside a changing environment. So it would be foolish of me to suggest that the ever-changing randomization of roguelikes makes player success entirely dependent on luck instead of skill. But that doesn't necessarily equate to them being fair or even fun. The player isn't making decisions based upon risk and reward, they simply have a choice of random upgrades. You either use them or you don't. There's no risk in equipping them, nor is there any reward for not equipping them. Meaning the optimal decision is to take whatever you can get, even if it's not very good. Some upgrades add so much versatility to the game that they should have just been permanent, like resetting the grapple hook cooldown after killing a hooked enemy. This isn't just some increased statistic, like a damage buff, it's a major change to how the player traverses the environment and forms improvisational strategies. Deadlink does, in fact, host a wonderful risk-reward system, with its challenge rooms that afford additional compensation for mini-boss encounters, and its experimental implants that offer strong buffs for the entire run, if the player can survive several rooms with a strict debuff. If this player agency was more consistent across the whole game, or I could simply save a preferred loadout to begin with every run, I think I'd find these elements much less annoying. Usually I would be in support of systems that force players out of their bad habits and towards learning otherwise overlooked techniques, but not when it's dictated by a dice roll. The meta progression doesn't grant much meaningful permanence anyway. At first, I thought many of these were guaranteed additions to each combat shell, until I realized I was simply gaining the chance of obtaining these perks during future runs. The truly permanent unlocks are, disappointingly, mostly just grinding away at minor adjustments to arbitrary values. Increased damage output, reduced damage taken, enemies dropping more money, and so on. Investing in incremental statistical upgrades is a distracting chore in many real-time action games, existing to artificially increase difficulty in the early game and string players along until the end. Applying a buff to the player's health or damage output will likely result in greater victories, but it doesn't actually change how the game itself is played. The decisions and inputs made by the player are exactly the same, which is why I generally describe these upgrades as artificial, compared to more impactful tools that introduce new mechanics. To put it as simply as possible, a fire flower is more valuable than a super mushroom because it substantially alters the experience, expanding Mario's moveset instead of merely adding a +1 to his health. The same can be said when comparing the capabilities of Sonic's basic shield to one of the 3 elemental shields, which have more appealing value in their unique movement functions. Tying player statistics to an easily exploitable leveling system or random item spawns is where things become far more problematic. When Castlevania first made the leap towards action RPG, it was relatively unintrusive. Symphony of the Night can be completed without paying much attention to Alucard's stats, as most of the important powers are functional Metroid-style unlocks achieved through exploration. There's still the tedious process of checking every new weapon and piece of armor to see if it's outright better than whatever is currently equipped, but it's not overbearing. This is not the case for the later titles, which were obsessed with locking versatile powers behind random enemy drops. Cards, souls, glyphs, they all range in terms of individual utility, but obtaining them blatantly requires grinding. due to their incredibly low drop rates. My first time playing Circle of the Moon was crushingly difficult for the first few hours, because none of the enemies dropped any cards, leaving me very underpowered. Aria of Sorrow forces the player to obtain and equip 3 particular enemy souls to access its true endgame, transforming grinding into a mandatory activity. The Souls series, essentially the 3D evolution of Castlevania, has many similar issues, all born from the inclusion of RPG systems. Any excitement from finding a new item is undercut when it's just a duplicate set of gear with worse stats than what I'm already wearing, or something I can't even use with my current build. The volume of decisions to be made by the player may have increased, but they're not particularly interesting ones. Give it enough time, and searching through the inventory becomes its own boring minigame, although in its defense, at least these items can be sold. Sudden difficulty spikes can occur not from a lack of skill, but from unbalanced player statistics. Sometimes a boss would feel so strong that I would decide to momentarily explore elsewhere, only to return after having leveled up and find it was now far too easy. I was wondering why a fight in Dark Souls 3 was taking so much of my health, until I realized it was the final boss of the DLC that I wasn't really supposed to be fighting yet. I felt as if my skill was at least good enough to make it through after a few attempts, but I ultimately decided it wasn't worth the trouble when my present build was 30 or 40 levels below expected. Of course, I only knew of this after researching online, because how is anyone supposed to intuit such information on their own? Dealing chip damage against a boss that can lock me into instant death feels like time better spent elsewhere. Maintaining a balanced experience should be the role of the designers, not the player. For these reasons, I still like Dark Souls quite a lot, but I love Sekiro. It's still brutally difficult, but I always felt responsible for my failures, overcoming them through skill instead of numbers. Grinding can only get you so far when health and damage upgrades are mostly obtained from clearing the pantheon of tough bosses, not through exploiting the in-game economy. This is where the progression of roguelikes bothers me. Each run is spent leveling up some numbers to make you stronger, or getting better weapons with higher numbers attached to them, so that you can level up some permanent numbers that will make you a little bit stronger for next time. But of course, the outcome of next time is still determined by luck, which arguably defeats the purpose of meta progression in the first place. To be clear, lock and key design that gates progress if the player is lacking crucial items or abilities is perfectly fine. These are usually obtained by engaging with the game to its fullest in fresh and interesting ways, like uncovering new areas, defeating a unique boss, or solving a tricky puzzle. But when the deciding factor of a consistent, fair experience, and therefore your progress, is a series of player-managed statistics which are mostly increased through random drops and grinding, then something has gone wrong. Perhaps Deadlink's most beneficial alteration from the standard roguelike structure is the absence of procedurally designed environments. The placement of choke points, jump pads, ammo pickups, and C-balls all feel thoughtful and intentional, a rarity under the roguelike umbrella. In the same way that we have collectively seen through the facade of open-world games being sold on their surface area alone, I think it's time to do the same for randomly generated levels. Your map may be 10 times the size of Grand Theft Auto 5, or your roguelike could have millions of possible level layouts, but how much of it is good? With some rare exceptions, an algorithm simply cannot craft a space as cohesive, memorable, and engaging as one born from the human mind, especially when these levels change again after dying. Building familiarity and mastery over a permanent world can be extremely rewarding, which is why I view Minecraft as a positive example of procedural world generation. It suits the player-driven, resource-gathering sandbox focus, keeps the world feeling natural and predominantly untouched by man, and facilitates exploration by persisting throughout one's full playthrough. Subnautica is a similar survival crafting game, but has a much stronger focus on following a set narrative from beginning to end, so it benefits from a handmade map that guides the player to the right locations. Darkwood generates a new map at the beginning of a save file, but this is mostly to shuffle the locations of the major areas, which were all deliberately designed by human beings. Furthermore, it enhances the survival horror atmosphere by forcing players into a slightly unfamiliar overworld if they choose to play the game again, without harming its overall structure and narrative progression. Before I played Deadlink, Prey Mooncrash was the one good roguelike in my eyes, likely due to its thoughtfully constructed permanent map. Arcane Studios are masters at designing multifaceted three-dimensional spaces, so it would have been an enormous disservice to see its world made of awkward chunks randomly sewn together every run. I say all of this to avoid condemning procedural generation outright, but also to highlight why I view it as such a misguided inclusion in most roguelikes. Deadlink's energetic combat would have easily been soured if its stages were all spat out by a machine, lacking the polish and care inherent to a consistent set of levels that can be intentionally directed and thoroughly playtested. Permadeath is perhaps the most frustrating tactic employed by roguelikes to extend playtime, repeating near-identical content in perpetuity until luck finally aligns with your skill. This is a contentious topic for me to describe, because proving one's ability to remain consistent and capable across one seamless run of a game, especially one that's always changing, absolutely is a form of mastery, and I think it's great that roguelikes encourage it. This, unfortunately, does not offset the time wasted between each attempt, playing through the same levels on loop to land another shot at the one section that's giving you trouble. I find these systems much more understandable as optional challenges for experienced players, like Doom's Ultra Nightmare difficulty and Horde mode. The simple inclusion of a warm-up feature for Devil May Cry 5's Bloody Palace allows the player to practice specific levels and bosses at any time. A perfect compromise that respects your time without removing the challenge of its core experience. Dead Cells does actually have this same feature, which is great, but it's worth considering that the player's equipment and stats will always be different when they face these bosses in the main game. It's also tucked away enough that I didn't stumble upon it until I was gathering footage for this video. The dread instilled from the threat of losing progress can be used to great effect in horror games like Resident Evil, where the act of saving is tied to a resource the player must manage. Now it's ultimately the player's fault if their next death sets them back further than they'd like, but at least they're not booted all the way back to the start of the game. It's generally more rewarding to replay a game, or even just sections of one, because I want to, not because I have to in order to progress. Even typical campaign-centric games like Tears of the Kingdom have suffered for similar reasons. The creative building mechanics kept me engaged for hours, exploring the skies above and depths below, until I became fatigued by the map's shameless repetition. I'd find the same islands, bosses, enemies, and rewards everywhere I went, in a land that was still broadly identical to its prequel that I'd already spent 200 hours in. Clunky inventory management, multiple loading screens for every shrine, and a painfully slow armor upgrade system didn't help either. After a while, all I wanted was for the journey to end, so I could move on to something else. Without being too specific, Outer Wilds succeeds in its inherently repetitive permadeath-style premise by keeping its world small but dense, with points of genuine interest at every corner. Returning to a previously accessed location should only take a few minutes at most, especially after discovering shortcuts hidden within the environment. The meta progression between each life is knowledge, not skill points or any other tangible extrinsic motivator, because the player's curiosity is enough on its own. Unlike most regular enemies, the mini-bosses of From Software games don't respawn, because the game understands that the player has already proven themselves capable. Keeping said bosses in the world would simply make exploration tedious. In case you don't believe me, please refer to the infamous Chozo ghosts for a prime example. Samus in the 2D games gains substantial upgrades like the speed booster, space jump, and screw attack, not only to solve new environmental puzzles, but also to streamline the backtracking process and reduce any tedium. Perhaps it's worth interrogating where the concept of permadeath originates from. In the days of arcade games, machines simply weren't capable of storing individual save files, and even if they could, it wouldn't make much sense for hardware that was only playable in public spaces. A permanent failure state would result in the player inserting more coins to try again, or freeing the cabinet for another paying customer. Either way, the house wins. Early home console games inherited these systems, but without the monetary gatekeeping, until they were slowly phased out in favor of save systems and infinite lives. If you think we're long past this shady style of game design, keep in mind that the thriving mobile game market often employs permanent death to coax the player into spending money, along with many other predatory systems that are now alive and well in full-priced home releases. I don't think roguelikes are directly comparable to these negative practices, as they're usually a one-off purchase like most other games. However, as harsh as it sounds, due to their emphasis on luck and randomization, roguelikes are basically a form of gambling. Not with your money, but your time. Go on, insert another hour of your life into the machine. Just one more try. Surely this time you'll finally get lucky. It's impossible for me to shake the feeling that the popularity of roguelikes is closely linked to the consumption of games as products, or content, instead of art. Thoughtful, creative, and inspiring games aren't enough for some consumers. They need to be hundreds of hours long and constantly change, even in the most surface-level ways, to sell the illusion of value. It's worth acknowledging that most roguelikes are relatively cheap independent titles, maintaining an optimal dollar-per-hour rate for those who actually care about such pointless metrics. Maybe if you can only afford one game to play all year, a roguelike is a solid choice, but I think this misses the point. Of course, games are commercial art, but if we try to separate the financial elements from the equation and evaluate the work on its own terms, as just art, then our perception may begin to warp. You may be able to objectively measure the hours spent playing a game, but how did those hours actually feel, subjectively? Outer Wilds is the greatest game I've ever played, even though its knowledge-based progression makes it impossible to replay. This isn't really a flaw. If anything, it makes the game so much more special. Its value isn't derived from some financial investment I made, but the incredible time I spent immersed within this world and longing to learn its secrets. I don't have hundreds of hours in Sea of Thieves for the pursuit of its live service loot and experience grind, repeating the same boring PvE missions and getting upset when another player steals from me in a pirate game. What brings me back is the intrinsic value I receive from engaging with its mechanics. It's just fun. There's no statistical progression system or more powerful weapons, making every battle a balanced test of knowledge, skill, and improvisation. We don't want an alliance anymore, we hate you.
Did you just them over by telling a little lie? Oh,
I think I destroyed their alliance, yes. Immersive sims, such as Dishonored and Prey, may be a form of RPG, but they sidestep the typical number crunching by focusing on more meaningful elements like exploration and puzzle solving to unlock versatile abilities. Being rewarded with substantial new gameplay options through the completion of bespoke interactions and challenges thoughtfully crafted by the designers is much more interesting than just smacking low-level enemies around until getting a level up. Item randomizers for games like Metroid and Zelda operate under the notion that the player has already mastered the core experience. Their proficiency with movement, combat, and world design is transferable, now being put to the test in an altered context. Key items might require more complex speedrun strategies in order to obtain, and late-game items might be obtained early, but at least a skilled player knows exactly where all of these upgrades could be, and how they can access them without the expected equipment. It's easy to imagine how miserable a randomized playthrough of Super Metroid would be if you'd never played the vanilla version beforehand. Take out all the save rooms and we'd essentially have how it feels to play a roguelike, and I think the game's quality would suffer considerably. People may think they want seemingly infinite content that's vaguely different every time, when what they really want is a tightly designed experience with all the best gameplay options consistently available. Something they'll rarely ever get when the unlocks are randomly shuffled every run. I shouldn't have to say this, but I don't think you're a lesser human being for enjoying and/or developing roguelikes. But I do hope that my, perhaps controversial perspective has offered you the chance to reflect somewhat. Maybe you find their strong difficulty and encouragement towards mastery to be refreshing, and I ultimately agree. But if that's the case, I'd say you're much better off investing time in other titles that accomplish much the same, and have greater respect for your time. Devil May Cry and Bayonetta offer a host of crushing difficulty options and secret missions that demand proactive, stylish finesse, forcing you to fully comprehend their expressive combat systems. Doom Eternal's base campaign and DLC are extremely rewarding to complete on Nightmare, but the master levels are even better, offering a true test of skill for those bold enough to try. These titles, and many others, all offer hundreds of hours of fun if you're willing to dive deep, and most importantly, don't rely on luck, grinding, procedural level generation, or permadeath. I've made it quite clear why I really can't get into roguelikes, but my feelings on Deadlink in particular are a little conflicted. Other than Prey Mooncrash, it's the only roguelike I've ever truly enjoyed. But this is mostly because the randomization elements are comparatively less intrusive. When luck is in my favor, and I get to play with all the fun implants and shell upgrades in perfect harmony, it can be extremely satisfying. I just wish Deadlink could always play like this, like in all the other campaign-focused movement shooters that I adore. Producing this video has postponed my first full playthrough of the recently launched Turbo Overkill, a game that aligns much closer with my personal taste. Embracing the interactive and dynamic elements of video games is great, as they're the only artistic medium with such capability. But roguelikes perpetuate a myth that the content of a game should change every playthrough, whether that's with narrative choices, skill tree paths, or something else. The issue is that games already do this. Even the most linear action games will see you making completely different split-second decisions between playthroughs or alternate difficulty selections. You'll likely find previously challenging stages much easier, or perhaps you'll uncover a secret area that you never noticed last time. Maybe you'll earn a higher score, or a faster time, or master a new technique. Incentivizing replays with new or slightly altered content is nice, but it's not required to make them intrinsically rewarding if the game was fun in the first place. To be clear, this is about replaying because you chose to, not because you're forced to. Every playthrough of every game is already unique, not just because of the game changing, but because of you, the person playing it. If roguelikes, roguelites, and action RPGs in general are to continue, perhaps it's worth undergoing a moment of introspection. Can these games still be punishing, near infinite, and random without being unfair and needlessly wasting time? Can they achieve this without then switching to the other extreme, becoming shallow, easy, and overly convenient? Are the underlying moment-to-moment gameplay systems just better off in more traditionally designed experiences instead? I don't have all the answers, but that's why I just don't play roguelikes. Except for Deadlink, which manages to earn my recommendation in spite of it all.